Hi, Internet. My name is Matt Welch. I am the editor-in-chief of Reason Magazine, the magazine of free minds and free markets. I am also the author of the newly out in paperback, McCain, The Myth of a Maverick. I am as pleased as Sarah Palin in rutting season to be joined by Eli Lake, the crack reporter for the New York Sun, and a man who's done more foreign policy reporting this week than I have in the last 2 years. Eli, how the hell are you?
I'm good. Thanks a lot, Matt Welch. It's great to do finally blogging against with you. I'm an admirer of Reason Magazine, yourself, and the libertarian movement.
This is log rolling in our time. I'm enjoying it. So let's go straight to what you've been writing about even today, the attacks on Yemen that have happened earlier this week. You've described them, or people have described them to you, as a wake-up call to the U.S. and perhaps the broader West. Can you describe how and why?
Yeah, well, there's the three governorates of Yemen that border Saudi Arabia are believed by the intelligence community in general to be a kind of new safe haven for al-Qaeda. How do we know this? Well, there are these committees of vice and virtue that usually sort of a telltale sign that al-Qaeda is taking over from a kind of local governance perspective. These are the guys that go around and find people who are drinking or smoking and kind of apply the appropriate Islamic penalty. That there have been reports of that. The government of President Saleh in October let out the mastermind of the USS Cole bombing, as well as a guy named Moheshi, who is believed to be a former aide-de-camp of Osama bin Laden, who is now believed to be the leader of something called al-Qaeda in Yemen, which is related to the group. I don't want to get too technical here, but it's related to the group that claimed credit for the bombing of the embassy on Wednesday, which is Islamic Jihad in Yemen. And that group, Islamic Jihad in Yemen, an interesting tidbit that I didn't get in my reporting yet, apparently was founded by someone who's known to go as Dr. Fadl, who is the Egyptian theologian who kind of turned late last December in Egypt after spending a lot of time in the Egyptian prison system, and was a former very close associate of Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 of al-Qaeda. Anyway, so Dr. Fadl, almost a year ago, kind of comes out with this public declaration saying, you know, the way of terrorism and the way of sort of Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda and jihad is not really Islamic anymore, and it's been a failure and a disaster. But this group that he sort of helped inspire and found pulls off what was a fairly sophisticated attack with, you know, a fire support team, rocket-propelled grenades. A lot of these guys were wearing Yemeni military uniforms.
And some you think come from the security or intelligence.
Well, I don't think that. That's a question. I wrote it as specifically. That's something that is going to. It's a lead because there were eyewitness reports from diplomatic security and others that said that some of the attackers were wearing military uniforms from Yemen. There were also Yemeni military. So there were also Yemeni soldiers who were killed in the attack. So it's possible that al-Qaeda got a hold of, or the Islamic Jihad of Yemen, which is pretty much al-Qaeda in Yemen, got a hold of military uniforms, or it's possible that there were members of the military in Yemen who, like similar to Pakistan's ISI or Pakistan's military, really had their allegiances with the enemies of the state. And so I think what you're dealing with in Yemen is an incredibly weak state that had stopped, similar to President Musharraf, had stopped pretty much fighting the war on terrorism around the same time, too, in 2006. And, you know, as a result, had pardoned him. There was a very suspicious, in 2006, a very suspicious maximum security prison break, the equivalent of the Yemen Alcatraz, where senior al-Qaeda people had gotten out of. And so the question is, you know, how does that prison, you know, it's very hard to break out of that prison unless there was some sort of inside collaboration and collusion. That's not to say that President Saleh is on the side of Osama bin Laden. It's just to say that I think he doesn't have the political will and maybe the political capabilities to prosecute the war.
Now, Yemen is not Pakistan in terms of size and regions beyond your geographical control. It's a small state, and it's one where, correct me if I'm wrong, the U.S. has had a fair amount of influence over the last 8 to 10 years. What went wrong?
Well, influence, I mean, yes, after 9/11, the U.S. built up the Yemeni Coast Guard and the Yemeni Border Patrol, and there was some training, but it's a fairly backwoods country. I've actually never been to Yemen. I have a close friend who served there, and he's told me that it's you know, Sana'a is a typical kind of Middle Eastern city, but it's a backwater. So
I understand everyone chews a lot of cat and carries long machetes.
Yes. Got, yes. Then the Hour of Solomon, if you chew enough of it, apparently you get these pleasant hallucinations.
Now, are you chewing cat to help you?
No, I'm chewing nicotine.
Okay.
Which helps me not smoke cigarettes.
Does it indicate anything to you that is the emergence of Al-Qaeda there in Yemen and also to a degree in Pakistan, is that a sign they're being flushed away from Iraq and from Afghanistan, or what does it indicate to you?
Well, first of all, I think it's very clear that people who were kind of veterans of the Iraq War, they went to several places. One place I think they went to was Aleppo in Syria, but they went to Yemen and they went to Pakistan because in Yemen there's no government, there's no monopoly of violence from the central government in these provinces apparently. Secondly, though, I think in some ways, and this is not an argument for that someone should invade Yemen, but it's also just the shortcomings of a policy of what really Bush did after 9/11 and what Powell sort of oversaw, which was that we enlisted all these states that were on the fence and weren't really terrifically good allies in the war on terrorism, and we sort of gave them money. We got in some cases bases like in Central Asia, and then the result was we wanted them to be our eyes and ears and our proxies in this fight against Al-Qaeda, and in some cases like where you have a deep kind of almost kind of a cultural affinity and in a place like Yemen for ascetic versions of Islam, or in a place like Pakistan where there's such a disparity of wealthy. I mean, there is a problem that it only goes so far. The institutions that we were counting on to be our kind of shock troops or front lines in that war have ended up being fairly corrupted. And in the case of Pakistan, I think you could say in the case of Yemen, it ended up being ultimately a bad bet. That you can't count on.
Which undermines U.S. credibility to people who are maybe under the thumb of those autocratic governments themselves, or at least is some kind of an irritant. Yeah, I've always been struck by in the sort of pure idealistic elements of neoconservatism, of being, helping help democratize or liberalize the broader Middle East and just Islam in general, which is a project on paper actually looks great. But if you're going to have a sort of interventionist approach, you're going to have to make deals with the devil constantly, which directly undermines that. And I think it's a.
Well, I would say that's not neoconservative. That's the Bush administration, which I would say is sort of has so many internal paradoxes that you can't say it's realist, you can't say it's neoconservative. It's Bush's approach dealing with an imperfect world. Now, I don't think anybody in their right mind, if they were president, would not have wanted the president to make deals with these security services that do nasty things to their citizens after 9/11. That was pretty much the only option really there was. I mean, we don't have an army that's big enough. We don't want to draft. You can't invade all these countries where that Al-Qaeda has set up and established a safe haven. So you've got to work with what you've got. So it's not necessarily saying that was a bad policy. It's just to say that we now are seeing that policy is also insufficient. And that's why I've said this on Blogging Heads before, but as for the democratization and liberalization project, knowing ahead of time that you're going to have to make deals with the security services, that the democracy and the liberalization part cannot be a state project, which is to say that, if we can figure out ways to get kind of freedom-minded George Soroses and other billionaires that didn't lose all their money in the doings in Wall Street this week, to sort of think ahead about creating kind of independent media and supporting liberal political parties that are not affiliated and have nothing to do with the U.S. government, that's probably a much more effective model than what we've got now.
It's interesting. You are also talking a lot about Pakistan, which is certainly where, in fact, I think you broke some news about U.S. incursions there.
Week.
Talk about that a little bit, and what's new, and then what's the difference between the two leading presidential candidates on this front?
President Bush in July, the New York Times wrote the story 2 days after I wrote the story, but the New York Times and the New York Sun before the New York Times reported that in July, President Bush signed an order that gave Central Command effectively control to sort of launch these raids, which are now on a near daily basis, into Pakistan from Afghanistan. There were raids into Pakistan before, but they were few and far between, and usually the Pakistani government was informed about this at least the U.S. ambassador in Islamabad was informed about this.
And by raids, give us an idea. We're talking about 12 special forces guys, one horseback with mustaches, or
I don't have that fine a grade of detail. What I can tell you is that there have been plenty of reports of drones and missile attacks, and this is before this order, by the way. Okay, but the problem is that not the problem, but I should say. I don't have that fine grade of detail, but basically, I think that what I've been told is that what these forces are doing when they go into Pakistan are the federal administered tribal areas of Pakistan where we believe Al Qaeda's leadership is based, is that they are painting targets for the drones and other missiles, and that they're in some ways gathering intelligence. And maybe down the road they might even look to see if they can recruit sort of friendly tribal folks to kind of give them further intelligence. But that's sort of what they're doing. I mean, but they have to do that because there's been, to use a Vietnam analogy, at the very least, the areas of Pakistan have been effectively like the Cambodia for the Taliban in Afghanistan, which is to say that they're able to kind of get safe haven there. And that has made it so that, the Taliban probably is competing for, 50% of the country, 40% of the country at this point. So the situation in Pakistan from the perspective of just the war in Afghanistan has become untenable as a result of Al-Qaeda in these provinces along the border from Pakistan, A. And B, it's Osama bin Laden is there. So if you could get Osama bin Laden, if you could get Ayman al-Zawahiri, if you could get any of these sort of senior leaders that are there, it would be a good thing.
How do these revelations play out in Islamabad, officially and unofficially?
Well, Islamabad is in a situation where they have a very weak government because Nawaz Sharif, a former prime minister, pulled out of the anti-Musharraf coalition last month. And as a result, the government of President Zardawi is still sort of finding its sea legs. Also, they're dealing with the revelations from, I think Steve Kappas, the head of the CIA, sent a very high-level delegation in August to Pakistan to meet with General Kiani, the chief of staff, and other sort of civilian and military leaders, saying, listen, we think that the ISI at fairly significant levels was involved in the attack on the Indian embassy in Kabul, which is completely unacceptable. So here you have a real example of how the original plan was, after 9/11 particularly, was we're going to turn around the Pakistani intelligence services, the Pakistani military, to fight against Al-Qaeda in their own country and sort of subcontract that part of the war out to them. And what ended up happening was these institutions were so corrupted that ultimately they stopped fighting centrally in 2006, allowing for officially, you could say, a kind of home rule of Al-Qaeda and Taliban in these provinces that are now being raided. But also, it was another bad bet, another deal that didn't work out. So the result is, because that deal didn't work out with Musharraf ultimately had to step down. The plan B is these raids from CENTCOM and special forces from Afghanistan into Pakistan.
And the idea, I would imagine, is that with a weak central government that depends still to a great degree on U.S. aid and assistance on all number of levels, Washington is just rolling the dice that, what are they going to do in protest of this? And those people in the regions there that the Taliban control aren't necessarily friends to Islamabad anyway. So It's more of a question of managing public relations.
Well, they say it's not in their interest, but I think that there are several people who pretty high up in the Pakistani security apparatus. Hamid Gul was a former head of the ISI, and Hamid Gul is, now openly with the Taliban. And that's fairly recent. Nawaz Sharif, according to Richard Clark in his book, was receiving money from Osama bin Laden's organization in the 1990s. So they're fairly high-up people in these parties that have had to cut deals with, the jihadist elements. Christopher Hitchens, in his column this week in Slate, which we should link to, on Pakistan, points out that we know from the sort of 9/11 decommissioning that there was ISI agents on the ground at an Al-Qaeda training camp when Clinton ordered the missile strikes in the 90s. What were ISI agents doing at a training camp with Al-Qaeda? So I think
were they on that jungle gym thing?
Exactly.
The beardy jungle gym.
Yeah, the beardy jungle gym, right? But I'm saying that that you've got a serious problem in that these people who I think, and let me go one step further. I think the CIA is no longer really like kind of, what originally it was when it was the OSS in World War II and the early CIA. I think the CIA after Stansfield Turner has turned into the State Department of nasty intelligence and security services all around the world. And they are much more comfortable working with other local security services. And it's all premised on the idea that in the end of the day, the United States, similar to the kind of model from the British, will control these institutions and ultimately kind of, will have the necessary influence to that this works. And this does work in a country like Jordan for now, but it doesn't work in a country like Pakistan, because what we thought were our allies, in many cases, at least from an institutional perspective, turned out to be our worst enemies. And that's the problem. That's what we're dealing with. That's why these raids are happening right now.
Interesting that you should name-check the OSS. One of John McCain's more curious or just intriguing policy proposals is to basically relaunch it, in addition to the existing CIA, launch what would be patterned after the original OSS during World War II.
He should get rid of this. I mean, I hope he gets rid of the CIA if he's president. I mean, they should start again. I mean, I'm not against the CIA. The CIA has a lot of really talented, patriotic people. I'm not one of these people who's going to like complain. And it's a tough job, and of course, it's all secret, so we never know about their successes. We blah 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 blah. But I just think that there's just such an institutional groupthink that always comes back to this model of working with our allied intelligence services, and we're seeing in Yemen, in Pakistan, and I think down the road, I lived in Egypt for a year, we'll see in Egypt and these other places that it doesn't necessarily work, and it won't always work, and we need to come up with a better approach to it, and hopefully General Petraeus is maybe beginning to sort of think through that stuff now, but yeah, I mean, I hope if McCain is president, he does do that.
I spent a lovely week in Denver at the Democratic Convention, mostly going to the various foreign policy confabs, both official and unofficial, all of which seem to have Madeleine Albright front and center, which I found pretty interesting, given that she's sort of the definition of the liberal hawk, and liberal hawkery was supposed to be on the run in the Barack Obama-led Democratic Party. But one area of difference that they love to paint, and this is from Obama on down. Richard Danzig, who's I think his chief foreign policy guy, or one of them, the former Navy secretary, is they said, hey, look, we want to take the fight to Pakistan. We want to actually hunt bin Laden where he lives, not the gates of hell, but the gates of Pakistan.
Right.
And they kept sort of crowing that the McCain campaign and to another extent the Bush administration is finally following Obama's lead that he was taking some flack for, if I recall correctly, in the spring for saying that we should launch incursions into Pakistan and refocus the war on terror that way. I found it very striking on a number of levels, one of which a cynic might say that Obama wants to put more troops and have a stronger fight wherever our troops are not currently, whether it is in Pakistan or Darfur or other places. But also for someone whose campaign certainly took off like a shot because of his opposition to the Iraq War in 2002, and his sort of principled case, or stated as a principled case, that he's going to change the foreign policy mindset in Washington, D.C., not just the foreign policy. It's interesting that
I've placed a bet with Matthew Iglesias in the Center for American Progress on that.
What was the content of the bet?
The content, the mindset of foreign. I think Obama is going to if he's president. I've said this before. I wrote this for the New Republic this summer. He's going to destroy the left, especially the foreign affairs anti-war left. He's going to destroy the anti-war movement.
Because he's going to be basically a Clinton second-term type of humanitarian interventionist, or sort of somewhat of an interventionist, and the anti-war base is going to have their heads explode?
No, I think he's going to be a Reagan-esque black pajama covert war assassination squad hit team kind of, George H.W. Bush CIA type president. That's what I think. Get ready for it, people. No, I think first of all, Obama. Let's just, we're riffing. But this wasn't on the schedule, but let's just go through it, Matt Welch. Okay? Do you think Obama is going to exit all the troops and not have permanent bases whatever that means, in Iraq. Do you think that that's going to happen?
I think that there will be some kind of permanent, or like the embassy in the green zone will have a permanent garrison in the 5 figures, I think. But, I mean, I'm guessing. I just can't imagine how not to do it. Every, just like every president or presidential candidate campaigns on, like, cracking down on China and getting tough with X. What ends up happening with the responsibility and the temptations of governance, and I don't know which is bigger. You end up saying, well, we actually have to do this. If we leave, there's going to be a bloodbath. So I think it's going to be much less hasty withdrawal than he has intimated.
I don't think it's going to be really much of a... I think that there is going to be a withdrawal down to, as Colin Kahl in his paper said, 50 to 80,000 or 60 to 80,000 troops. I don't know the number, but it's going to be in the tens of thousands. So I think there's going to be tens of thousands of troops in Iraq after his first term. A. B. I think despite what Maliki said over the summer, Maliki wants an air force, which is the U.S. government. So there's going to be more than 1 or 2 permanent bases. There are going to be long-term leases. There will be a status of forces long-term agreement that Obama will negotiate with the Iraqis that will probably not look that different than what would be negotiated under McCain, I don't think. So I don't think anything's really going to change on Iraq. And then I think that he's probably going to, in cases where he can, and this is not because Obama's being disingenuous. And I think, based on sort of reading up on him, in the 80s and the 90s, he was a leftist. Fair enough. Okay, fine. I was a leftist. That's why I can't get upset about it. When I was in college, I was a socialist, so I can understand how your views can change.
Were you a member of CISPAS?
No, I wasn't an Acorn community organizer, but I was a member. I was the president of Progressive Student Alliance, and I once signed, very embarrassed to say this, I once signed a petition for sons and daughters of the Cuban Revolution.
Oh!
I can't believe I did it, but I did it because at the time, I saw a speech, I got excited, I said, why is everybody saying all this bad stuff about Castro? Anyway,
I'm glad this is on the permanent record, frankly.
It's on the permanent record. Anyway, so I was a comm simp back in the early 90s. But anyway, the point is that Obama is going to deal with, if he's president, he's going to probably deal with the cards that he's dealt. And the cards that he's dealt are that, it doesn't make a lot of sense, especially since I think at the end of the day, the Iraqi government is going to want some overwatch forces in Iraq. The big contentious issue, as I said on an earlier dialogue, is going to be this Sunni intelligence service. Then it's going to come to Pakistan. Obama has already announced that he's willing to hit the Pakistani, hit those terrorists in the Fatah regions in Waziristan without telling the Pakistani government. That's going to likely continue unless, he succeeds in rebuilding a Pakistani military. In either case, do you think, Matt Welch, that war that he is prepared to fight in this region of Pakistan, which needs fighting, I might add, is going to be done, without bad guys getting tortured or bad guys torturing people? I mean, do you think that that's really going to happen? I don't. Okay.
There might be some difference of ROE, as they say on HBO's Generation Kill, and a difference in emphasis. I mean, I think the broader point that you make is interesting and largely right. Like, given the cards that he's dealt with, he's going to play them, and he has been making. He's trying to outflank, to some degree, McCain even on a place like Iran. He's saying that it's intolerable for an Obama administration that they develop a nuclear weapon, and we're going to mobilize everything possible. And I think there's always a temptation with a Democratic president, especially one who's winning because of, at least won the nomination based on anti-war sentiment, to kind of prove himself with the military and prove that he can be tough and have a spine, since he doesn't have a lot of military experience himself. But I think it is also wrong to presume that there's going to be, a total commonality with a McCain approach. So I think with McCain, it's not like what are his stated policies and what's going to happen. It's what happens when the unexpected comes down. How will his reaction be? Mm-hmm. And I think that in every case, and this was really shown in the Georgia crisis, he is a serial exaggerator of threats that he is correctly identifying as threats, which is to say that Russia is malevolent and nasty in general, but also especially in its near abroad, and it's going to be trying to screw with countries and regions whether it's in Georgia or Moldavia. But McCain says, hey, they're trying to restore not just the Soviet Empire, or not just the Russian Empire, but the Soviet Empire, or vice versa. Total exaggeration. That's not going to happen. McCain is always looking for some new transcendental crisis, and he wants to put us, and his answers to almost every single military question is more boots on the ground. I mean, here's a guy who in Kosovo not only supported Clinton and basically popped every liberal hawk's cherry in the 1990s, kind of literally by being a lonely Republican voice supporting the president's
and the editors of the Weekly Standard.
And the editors of the Weekly Standard.
And the editors of the Forward before they became the editors of the New York Sun. And the neoconservatives, by the way. The neoconservatives supported Kosovo against Tom DeLay and Bob Dole and all the other people.
Right, but not only did McCain support that, and transparency should point out that I did too, although I have postpartum regrets, is that he said that we would fail unless we put massive troops on the ground. He said that we were failing, as a matter of fact. Milosevic was winning, as late as April and May of 1999, and he also at the same time was saying I would rather lose an election than lose a war, and noisily dropping out of the campaign and making it a sign of his martial virtue. His default response is that America should take responsibility for the world's affairs, and whenever there's a new threat, I'm going to exaggerate it and call for sort of an exaggerated response with the number of troops on the ground.
I don't think he was exaggerating the stuff in Russia. I mean, I disagree with you on the first point of that.
That Putin wants to restore the borders of the Russian Empire?
The borders of the Russian Empire, maybe not so much, but the influence in all of the, at one point, all of the autonomous ex-Soviet republics, I think he wants to basically turn them into dependent client states, if not vassal states.
Sure, that's just different than the Russian Empire.
I think it is, though. I think it's really
Soviet Union. That's
Putin
the
is
Soviet
awful.
Union. The Russian Empire would be Czechoslovakia and other places that he thankfully can't touch, in part due to NATO expansion that a lot of bien pensant people poo-pooed, but it's the reason why the Baltics, I think, are off the table right now. But
Ukraine might be on the table with their election coming up. He did try to poison the anti-Moscow candidate the last time they had an election, and it required quite a bit of brave civil disobedience, I might add, from the Ukrainians to stop, what was essentially a Russian-led putsch in Ukraine.
Look,
I say this as an ethnic Ukrainian.
You won't out Russia hate me. My point with McCain is that even as he's accurately identifying Putin's malevolence and meddling and sort of illegal meddling in his near abroad, he then escalates the threat, one step further, and that to me is where the danger lies in a world which is sort of weary of America taking responsibility for its affairs. I don't think McCain ever sees a downside, literally, and I've asked him about this point blank, of the U.S. always being the world superpower, the world's global cop. He doesn't see sort of a game theory downside of what happens when we are always the force that people look to or fear. That itself will cause various dictators and nasties to, for instance, go after a nuclear program because they feel more unstable in a world where McCain wants to engage in rogue state rollback and other things.
Well, I don't think that countries pursue nuclear weapons. I mean, case in point, we know that the sort of secret cheating that the North Koreans were doing began while there was a President Clinton, and while if they were sophisticated enough to make a political gamble, would probably think that there was going to be a President Gore. And we know that the Iranian program began under Rafsanjani in the late 80s or the early 1990s. Again, not when America was sort of espousing a rogue state rollback policy. I think that bad, nasty regimes want nuclear weapons because they know ahead of time that they're not going to play by the basic rules of collective security, and that's their insurance for the survival of their regime. Now, that's a fact. I think that the reason they pursue, or if you want to argue like sort of the rationale of why they're pursuing these nuclear weapons, is got very little to do with the foreign policy rhetoric of people like John McCain or George W. Bush for that matter, and has much more to do with the international system as it is today, which is to say that we have a real problem. And I think let me go back to Russia just for a second. The problem with Russia is that it's pretty clear that they're not going to play by the basic rules of collective security because, they poison their dissidents, they invade Georgia, they commit cyber warfare against, Balkan states, they play this game of, basically like energy blackmail with Gazprom. These are things that the Russians do, which, I don't know, can we have an international system where a powerful actor is doing that? I'm not saying kick the Russians out of the UN. I'm just saying that I think that sometimes, thoughtful critics like yourself, Matt, misinterpret where McCain's coming from. I think that in part what a McCain administration would try to do is to come up with stopgaps and alternatives to the current international system for collective security to deal with the fact that we have actors within that system that are clearly not playing by those basic rules.
Well, I think that he would definitely go to the economic sanctions tool.
Yeah, and he wants to expand NATO.
More than just about anybody. Right. I have grave doubts about the efficacy of economic sanctions at any given time. I don't really think that they...
On this, we oddly agree. Yeah. That's so interesting. Why do you not like sanctions?
I don't like sanctions because they end up, I think they're counterproductive. They basically, in every case, with a possible exception of South Africa, which had a lot of different peculiar circumstances around it, they end up just strengthening the government that they intend to hurt and give them a plausible excuse. I mean, if you the comm simp, should know above all that sanctions against Cuba were about the only thing to hold that regime together. That, and of course, a horrible police state.
The police
for a long time.
But, no, I agree. I agree.
It gives them great intellectual rationale, and it just it hurts people, and it reduces the freedom of Americans, generally speaking, as well as sanctions against Iran, to cite one example, have ended up hurting dissidents there and preventing them from publishing in the U.S. because it's against the Trading with the Enemy Act. It's all very perverse.
That could be fixed,
awful.
but I see what you're saying. No, I agree. I agree. I think that sanctions, when you sanction it, exactly. I don't think that the Ayatollahs in Iran care about the Iranian people. So therefore, when you punish the Iranian economy, it just makes it does strengthen their hand. And certainly we saw that in Iraq. The thinking, if you remember, behind the original embargo after the Gulf War in the early 90s was that you would create such an economic crisis in Iraq that there would be a coup. And that's just a terrible bet. And also, you're dealing with a lot of innocent lives that way. I am in favor of something called targeted sanctions, where I think it is a good idea to seize the assets, and maybe one day, if we're lucky, the Iranians are such brazen terrorists. I just can't stand them anyway, but they send people who are, really bad types from their security services. They made a lot of them diplomats. So the guy who was responsible for the interrogation and torture of people like Akbar Ganji, for example, was sent as an envoy to the kind of new Human Rights Commission. So when you send somebody like that out there, who actually was also involved to get really technical with the case of the Canadian-Iranian photographer who was raped and killed and murdered in an Iranian prison, this guy was probably responsible for that. And the Canadian courts actually have found, his name is Montazeri, guilty. Not Montazeri, I'm sorry, that's the Ayatollah. I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember the name, I'm sorry.
A lot of long syllables.
So anyway, but maybe in that case, I wrote a column at the time saying, why can't somebody on behalf of Canada apprehend the man and arrest him? You know what I'm saying? Those are kind of targeted sanctions, taking their money, that kind of thing.
Right.
I'd be in favor of that, but the idea of, we're going to somehow increase pressure in Iran's by sort of making it tougher for them to import refined gasoline, which is an idea that's been kind of getting some currency. I don't think that there's much hope in that, because it presumes that Iran has a functioning sort of democratic system where, popular discontent can then translate into a change in government, which we know is a ridiculous. That's not true.
Yeah. I wanted to make sure that we got to your favorite topic, which is Sarah Palin, and who I think is single-handedly the most divisive figure in American politics since Clarence Thomas or O.J. Simpson or something. It's and it's through no fault of her own necessarily. My stupid anecdote, but my wife put on her Facebook like status page like. Emmanuel is thinking that Todd Palin is a dreamboat, obviously, because he's taking care of all the kids and doing things that Emmanuel's husband is not. And she like got shouted down by all of her friends, like, that's not funny. That is just not funny. These are dangerous people. I was at the Republican convention. And I thought her speech was mostly dynamite. There were a few lines in there that made me want to, throttle every Republican I saw for the rest of my life. But I thought in general it was just a very sort of winning and funny speech.
Yeah.
And I walked out and to the nearby bar, and there were people like, "Oh my God, that was the worst speech I've ever seen. I'm afraid to be alive." It's just a really bizarre, divisive person. But all that said, you, Mr. Foreign Policy guy. Do you feel comfortable with a, one-term Alaska governor who can gaze out onto the steppe of the Bering Strait, being the possible commander-in-chief with the oldest ever Republican president who's outlived his father and grandfather and was a smoker like you until he was age 40?
That is a tough question. I am not quite where David Frum is on this, but there's a lot we don't know about her, and but at the same time, I'm more and more of the view, and this is not a cop-out, but I'm more and more of the view that the national security bureaucracy is so vast, and Bush expanded it enormously, that it's very difficult for a president to come in. I mean, the president can focus and say, I'm going to change like 2 or 3 things, but I don't know that I don't know that any president can do much given the fact that we have these relationships we do in the world, that General Petraeus is now the head of CENTCOM. So yes, there are some potential pitfalls, but I don't know if it's as dangerous. I don't think she's like going to just nuke, Russia if they say the wrong thing about Ukraine or something like that. I don't think that's a realistic assessment. And I think from the Republican perspective, you got to win first, and she is a clearly politically brilliant pick from a tactical perspective.
So far.
Well, let me tell you something. There's a lot of I've been seeing this. A lot of sort of elite media types have been there's a venom that kind of comes out sometimes about Sarah Palin, accusing her of being a ditz and all these other things. I think that's playing into the McCain campaign's hands. And let me just say a political point here. I think that McCain, oddly, a politician who for the entire Bush years almost sort of sold himself as somebody who could reach across the aisle and attract independent voters, the swing voters. And as much as we hear about swing voters, it's obvious that the McCain campaign, at least, has made a calculation that this is a Karl Rove turnout election. And Sarah Palin will bring out the base of the Republican Party. And the last 2 presidentials, we know that base at least has turned out in greater numbers than the base of the Democratic Party. And I think to a certain extent, Obama has also been running a kind of Karl Rove type strategy, trying to bring out his base. So
I disagree with you. I think you're right about Palin's effects and the intent of her pick. I don't think that this is a pure or even like close to pure Karl Rove only election. If for no other reason that if it was Mitt Romney running right now, do you have any doubt that he would be behind 10, 15 points? McCain won the primary elections not because of the Republican vote, but because of independents and Democrats. I mean, even in New Hampshire, in South Carolina, in Florida, he never won even a plurality among people who describe themselves to exit pollsters as Republicans, which is remarkable in every way you look at it. And he won massive majorities among people who describe themselves as independents, Democrats, anti-war, and angry at George W. Bush. He needs to keep those people. So at any given time, his coalition and his message is totally schizophrenic. So I think, for instance, as it concerns foreign policy, he's constantly sending out messages that, oh, no, I'm a realist, I'm an Eisenhower Republican, because he needs to say those things to that independent Democratic support, the people who are just a little bit skeeved out for whatever reason, and I don't know what the word skeeved even means, of Barack Obama, especially on foreign policy. He needs to reach out to them. He can't reach out to them by talking up rogue state rollback and preemptive war and that kind of stuff. So he says, I'm an Eisenhower Republican. I talked to Brent Scowcroft at least once last month, and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, his policy hasn't changed. His advisors are not Brent Scowcroft. They're Randy Scheunemann.
I mean, but he's also running and saying, like, we're all Georgians now. I mean, McCain is making it pretty clear where he stands. I don't think he's trying to necessarily run away from the fact that he's fairly hawkish. I've always felt that hawkishness... He's sending
constantly mixed messages out there, and he has to. And the Palin pick is part of that. The Palin pick was him feeling secure enough in his sort of Republican hawk base that he could throw out somebody there who has a rather ridiculous resume on foreign policy without too many people, without losing Bill Kristol. He knew he wasn't going to lose Bill Kristol, and he was going to get a lot of the Christian conservatives who have treated him with a rather understandable arm's length distance.
By the way, the headline and reason for the piece that you should commission on how Bill Kristol is maybe going to influence or is happy with the Palin pick should be Crystal Palin.
Oh my God!
A joke.
I would point out that in his editorial talking about how the elite Eastern establishment, of which he's obviously never been a part of, is leaping down the throat of Sarah Palin, he used the word taint. That's all I'm going to say. It was there.
I can't stand that, by the way. I cannot stand. I have to say this because you mentioned the elite stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
We need elites in America. When William F. Buckley wrote God, Man at Yale, he wasn't arguing against Yale. He was arguing against the communists taking over Yale. There's a huge difference that this is an institution, and these are institutions worth preserving. That is the conservative argument. It's good to have people who know what they're doing, like who understand, Southeast Asia and, speak the languages, making our diplomatic policy. That's important. And conservatives used to worry that the universities were taken over by the left, but now it seems that at least there's a sentiment that, like, who needs universities? And that just is really problematic because, it's worth having, elite colleges and elite universities in order to train leaders or future leaders of industry, political leaders and cultural leaders and so forth, because there should be something approaching a common canon that everybody knows. And Bill Kristol, of all people who grew up, his father's Irving Kristol, ought to know better. Rudy Giuliani, he's a very cosmopolitan guy. He was the mayor of New York. He went on Saturday Night Live and dressed up as a woman. Come on. It's ridiculous.
He gave a speech against cosmopolitanism.
I know. I was there. I was there on the floor at the time. I was like, I couldn't believe it. I was like, what are you doing? I like Rudy Giuliani because he's so smart and well-educated and came from elite institutions.
He looks good in a dress.
What?
And he looks good in a dress.
Yeah. Now, this is not a defense of snobbery. It's not a defense of, like, kind of what can be, like, kind of an NPR, like, New York Times groupthink that, never, kind of considering other points of view. But, it's important to have elite institutions that are balanced and so forth. And that used to be a really important issue for conservatives that, you wanted to preserve these institutions and make sure that the left didn't take them over. And instead, now it's just like, who needs universities? And did you know Michael Crowley?
Name, not person.
Yeah, he wrote a piece for the New Republic about expertise and, like, how Bush is a big fan of Michael Crichton, because Michael Crichton, in all of his books, there's always, like, the guy who's supposed to know about airline safety, but, like, really doesn't know anything, right? And, like, sometimes the experts are just... And it's true, and this is a problem because there's a geometric expansion of knowledge, right? I mean, like, we just have so much that one person can't possibly know everything. It used to be, like, in the 19th century, John Stuart Mill pretty much knew everything that there was to be known. But today, we don't have that. So I can understand why a lot of people would sort of look around and sort of say, well, I can't possibly know everything I need to know about this, and, the experts always say, I'm just going to go with my gut or something like that. But it's important. You need experts. You need elites.
It's a really strange to me. I mean, not belonging to a political party and never have. So it's like I don't hear any of the.
I don't belong to a political party either, by the way.
The dog whistles don't work in my ear, and so it's just kind of bizarre. And to watch at the convention, how especially the pick of Palin became this sort of rallying cry of small-town America against, the terrible Washington elite. And it's clearly effective on some level. There's the perception that Obama is a big elitist compared to the salt of the earth John McCain. And as someone who's obviously written a book about him, I just feel like saying, do you realize that this dude has lived within, 30 miles of the nation's capital for 60 years? He was surrounding himself with, whether it's moneyed elite or military elite or journalistic elite, his entire life, from the time he was 10 years old, basically, once they stopped moving around to naval base after naval base. And that is the company that he prefers. If you go to Arizona and talk to Republicans about John McCain, a lot of them hate his guts for a variety of reasons, both good and ill from my point of view. But one thing that they will all say is that I don't like this guy, or, one thing about him is that he's a total elitist bastard. He never comes down and hangs out with the grassroots Republican base. John Kyle has coffee every week with these people, and they might have seen McCain once or twice in a decade when he blows through town on a big ticket fundraiser. They feel like he prefers his fancy Washington friends. There was even a funny Michael Lewis, who was the liberal journalist who fell probably hardest for McCain and wrote literally 30,000 words.
You consider him a liberal journalist? I love Michael Lewis, but I thought Liar's Poker was not the work of a liberal journalist.
It's his own description. I mean, he describes his own politics. Yeah, and he wrote kind of famously in '96, I'm feeling my knees are weak. I have a flush in the face. I know what it's like. Maybe what as a 14-year-old who finally discovered he loves boys. Could it be I finally like a Republican? And he was talking about John McCain.
Right.
It's all very embarrassing. But he wrote this defense because the Arizona press was making fun of the big man crush on McCain among Beltway journalists. And Lewis either wrote or was quoted in defense about this. It was quoted in a good piece by David Grant, I believe it was, saying that, hey, look, why should the Arizona people, think that they know McCain? He's actually one of us. He's a member of the Beltway establishment, and he really is. And his policy prescriptions and sort of a basic idea and worldview comes from a top-down area. And again, for good and for ill, as you say, we do need elites. You need naval officers. You need people who are sort of making decisions. But to have that top of the ticket running a campaign of sort of anti-elitism, a guy whose wife is a billionaire heiress and his mother was a billionaire heiress, and who's never really worked a day in his life in the private sector and has been pretty comfortable, it's rich.
Yeah, if I may, I just want to make one addendum to what I was saying, and then I want to respond to what you're saying about McCain for just a second. But in talk radio, not all talk radio, but people like Hugh Hewitt and Mark Levin are bring a lot of knowledge and expertise and have at times very thoughtful discussion. I mean, they're also sort of stroke the base a lot. But I listen to talk radio, and I have to say that they are themselves in some ways elites that are sort of talking to their audience, but it's not entirely anti-intellectual. In fact, Mark Levin, for example, really does get into this sort of political philosophy a lot on his shows. You would know that if you just read Media Matters, but so it's not black and white necessarily. What I find interesting is that Republicans who clearly are, national politicians who clearly are elites, like Mitt Romney, have to play and pretend that they're not, and it's just it's hypocritical. And at the end of the day, I mean, I think it's somewhat dangerous. Though I can also understand that these are the imperatives of American elections, and it's also a trend in American elections going back to Andrew Jackson, right? Andrew Jackson was not really qualified for office, and he was a pretty powerful president.
I mean, I think one aspect of it points to something positive. I think there is something in the American character which sort of values meritocracy and values sort of an authenticity on the kind of ground level. And I think that some impulse about that is positive. I mean, it's the sense that any college dropout can end up being the editor of a libertarian magazine. And
Were you a college dropout?
Sure.
Oh wow. So was James Toronto.
See, we all knew that he and I were exactly alike.
Yes.
And he's also from Southern California.
Yes.
I interrupted you. You were making another point.
Yeah. Well, on McCain, I'm just going to speak on foreign affairs. Okay.
Yes.
McCain did buck his party when it was not necessarily advantageous for his Washington career, for at least his career as a Republican. on the lack of the troops necessary for the Iraq War. Also, originally on the interrogation/torture issues. And there are a lot of issues where McCain, I think, at least in the conduct of the Iraq War and during the Bush years, was a real thorn in the side of the White House and probably had the better of the argument. That said, I credit Bush, by the way, with picking Petraeus, going with the surge, and all that other stuff. It's ultimately Bush and Petraeus. But McCain was there fighting for this policy, and he was kind of warning that you had to do something like that probably 2-3 years before they did it, and had people listen to McCain, would have been. I think the war would have gone better in 2005, 2006.
My critique of McCain is not that he, bends to the will of Washington, especially in foreign policy. He definitely, that's the issue that he's running on. It's the issue that he cares most about. And unlike, a ton of different economic issues, the one that he's been really consistent on, although he might have sent different messages time to time, but his bedrock belief, I think, is sort of ironclad. And, more troops on the ground can, with this great military, be an effective strategy. And in fact, it certainly has turned out better than a lot of critics, including myself, had predicted in Iraq.
Well, it wasn't just the troops on the ground. It was a new counterinsurgency.
Yeah, it's a new counterinsurgency strategy, sure. What I wonder about is how many different places, how many different times can you go to that one strategy, and and can you lose even in success? I think that's a question that's sort of interesting, or at least a
can I say something, Matt? I've detected that you worry that McCain is going to invade more countries. Is that right?
I think that he's more interventionist than Bush by a factor of 2. Believes in it to a degree. That Bush had to sort of be convinced after September 11th into going this direction, and I think has he has more of a hair trigger idea. He's more concerned with U.S. credibility whenever we sort of make a threat or issue sort of threatening language. He's more in the various magazine big blowouts on his foreign policy from this year. The Jeffrey Goldberg piece,
the Jeffrey Goldberg piece was really good, actually,
and the Matt Bai piece in the New York Times Magazine. In both of those, he expressed regret that he basically wouldn't be able to convince the American people that we need to intervene in places like Burma or Zimbabwe or Darfur. I think that's where his heart would want to go. And he sort of says, it's hard right now running someone who believes in the doctrine of preemption, and he expresses regret about that. I think that McCain presidency, and to your point earlier, yes, there are these big bureaucracies that are hard to move, especially in the State Department and to another degree the CIA. But the place where the president has the most leeway, in some degree, is choosing to use American force. And I think McCain will use American force much more eventually and much more thoroughly in each individual case than an Obama would. And I just don't think. I worry that we can't afford it on a variety of ways, whether it's just the pure money way or manpower way, or it creates its own bad effects, even if there are short-term individual successes that come from it, if you can follow me.
I don't think you should worry so much about that. And I'll tell you why. The troops aren't there. And unless McCain wants to reinstitute the draft, which I don't think he's ever said he would, and would be a disastrous idea.
He doesn't want to.
What?
He doesn't want to.
No, he doesn't want to, right.
Because he thinks that the rich people's sons would get out of it, and that pisses him off. It's basically his anti-Dick Cheney.
I wouldn't want to draft because it's compelling young Americans to do something that maybe they don't want to do. And also, you don't want an army with people who don't want to be there. But I guess my point here is that I don't think he has the option to intervene as much as you say. And I think part of it is, you got into it. The federal government just bailed out Bear Stearns, AIG, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Over time, even though the military GDP is less than 3% or something, or 4%, or 3%, I guess, of the GDP.
Less than 3.
I think at the end of the day, it's going to be very difficult to commit more troops. I mean, even though we've had the success we have in Iraq, it doesn't change the fact that a lot of the people a lot of the volunteers who have gone to Iraq have been on their third tours in a lot of cases, or fourth tours in a lot of cases, and that there is going to need to be at some point a rebuilding phase. And so I think that the McCain, whoever's president, won't have the option that Bush had, where you had an army that could invade, as Bush obviously did with Iraq and Afghanistan. So while you're right, maybe his inclination is such, but that kind of that sort of strong American exceptionalism that I think McCain has, which is one of the things that attracts me to him, will benefit, I think, the country and the world in negotiations ultimately probably with a country, like Iran. And it will probably benefit, it'll be better because the perception of McCain that, at any moment he's not shy about using the military will probably make our diplomacy more effective, don't you think?
Four quick things. No, I don't think the perception of America being more willing to use force will lead to a more stable or more secure world. I think that it'll foster more a sense of insecurity among people, and that'll sort of increase their nastiness. Although that's obviously, I'm just thinking, and it's not necessarily a fact-based analysis. But three quick things about McCain and the military size. He wants to increase the size of the military by 150,000 troops as a starting point. He wants to spend 4% of GDP on the military and thinks that should be locked in, although he hasn't made specific proposals for that, but that's his belief system. And he thinks that America should continue to spend 50% of the world's total expenditure on defense, and in fact increase that ratio. So I think that he's looking for ways to afford the types of sort of interventionism or capability, if you like a less loaded word, going forward. But he will definitely need to get there, and that'll be a difficult time.
I just don't think it's in the cards. Even if I know these, it would have been good, by the way, had Bush push to try to expand the size of the military after 9/11 when you had a real spirit of volunteerism after the attacks. But he didn't do that, and it's going to take a while, and I just don't think that the options are there. I think you're going to see more and more, whether it's McCain or Obama, as I said before, partnering where you can with local security forces. Partnering, and maybe in some cases, I think more likely under McCain, though possibly under Obama, with the kind of tribal actors in areas that are considered to be sort of disputed territories, like we saw in Anbar and later most of Iraq. And, trying to work as best you can without invading countries. I just don't think there's any more invasions that are on the table for a very long time. And that's because of the size of the military, and also because we know that it's difficult in an advanced democracy for you to sustain popular support for a war when Americans are doing the nasty work of war.
I find your faith touching.
All right.
we should, and I actually do. We should wrap this up, but obviously with a lightning round of irresponsible predictions.
Can I say one thing before we wrap it up?
Sure.
Americans, if you're watching, the reason to vote for McCain-Palin is because it's the opportunity to put an Eskimo in the Naval Observatory for the first time. And this election is a real message to First Nations everywhere. Todd Palin is a Yupik, okay? And we've never had an Eskimo second gentleman. Just want to point that out.
He's also, he's the biggest advance for feminism since Gloria Steinem first burned her bra. I think, he's a.
Or is she the anti-feminist because she's an independent, successful woman who doesn't believe in any of the policy prescriptions of Gloria Steinem?
Yes, I think
she's like feminist. She's like the doppelganger of feminism, maybe.
I think Todd Palin is the
Todd Palin, and Todd Palin is a champion snow machine racer.
Yes.
Isn't Alaska kind of a foreign country, Matt? I'm learning so much about Alaska, and I can't believe it. I'm like, that's in America? Wow.
My relatives have gone moose hunting in Alaska. They're from Oregon, and they engage in such behavior, and I find it all charming and credible.
Okay, so lightning round predictions. We should do another one of these dialogues, Matt, because I wanted to talk to you. I want to quiz you about libertarianism.
I'm glad I successfully avoided.
Because I'm a libertarian in a lot of ways.
Sure, except to blow up the world.
I want to know why I'm not technically a libertarian.
I'm not casting you out of the libertarian camp. I'm not the.
It's Ron Paul. I can't stand Ron Paul. So
there's a lot of libertarians who can't stand Ron Paul.
I know. You guys were so good on that, by the way. Once it came out with those newsletters, relentless.
Well, yeah, we covered it at the time. I don't think that we've made a huge deal out of it since then, but it was...
No, but at the time, you covered it relentlessly. It was really good. I remember.
Thank you. Prediction, if there is a conflagration in the world, a surprise, an October surprise, where would it be? Who would it involve?
You want to go first?
No, I have no idea. You're the foreign policy expert.
Gee whiz. Well, haven't we seen enough surprises?
That could be true, yeah.
I mean, I can't. I mean, I don't know. I mean, look at Pakistan right now. There's probably going to be some response from Al-Qaeda that they'll try to do, and probably in Pakistan, like Islamabad, as a result of the new policy of the raids. And I would say Pakistan would be one place, and another place is watch what happens in Ukraine, because a lot of people are predicting that could be the next target of Russian expansionism / meddling.
Yeah, I don't want to believe Ukraine because it seems like a bridge too far, even for Putin. But it's certainly the one that I'm as worried about of anyone. And who do you actually think is going to win the election, and by how much?
Wow. Well, I think it's a turnout election, and I think if any candidate has an opportunity to finally get out more than half of the young people who are registered to vote, because it's never happened before. The highest turnout was an anti-Nixon vote in '72 for McGovern. The second highest was in 2004. I just did a story on this. And I can't believe all these young people were voting for Kerry, who is probably a caucus-level candidate. It was an anti-Bush vote. So, but if anyone can inspire a positive vote among young people, I would think it would be Obama. So I still think it's probably going to be Obama, though I think the Palin factor makes it quite possible that the Republicans could squeak it out.
I'm still holding on to my Obama wins by maybe 3 points, unless there is a huge conflagration somewhere in the world that's going to make Americans.
Well, there's already been a lot of conflagrations in the world.
No, but but something that
like an Iranian nuke test or something.
Yeah, something where we actually think psychically that U.S. troops might get involved, or some kind of game of bluffing or whatever, to a greater degree than existed in Georgia, for example.
All right. Well, let me ask you a prediction question.
Sure.
If Obama loses, will we see a new SDS, and what will happen to the netroots? Will the netroots just become more radicalized?
I think that the netroots will, but I don't think that. I think in many ways, regrettably, just for bad art, if nothing else, we're never going to see the days of the weathermen and even the SDS and this kind of stuff. The netroots are they're mostly harmless at the end of the day. They can be irritating.
Yeah. What's this generation's of protesters' big contribution? The giant paper mache puppet. That's their big innovation.
Yes. Listen, I'm fully behind the giant rat. I think the giant rat should be everywhere, preferably around Washington, D.C. City Hall, because there's so many damn rats in this city.
It's true. There's so many rats in this city.
It's disgusting.
Yeah.
No, I don't think. I mean, someone asked me. I was at a forum a couple nights ago talking about the election,
right.
And the question was, what happens to race relations in this country if Obama loses? And call me a dyed-in-the-wool optimist, but I think the country is pretty great, and it's a lot better off than it was 10 years ago, even, or 20 or 30,
totally.
And certainly 40.
I agree.
I just don't think that we're going to be in a race war type of situation or anything like it. There's going to be a lot of people looking at
McCain Palin loses, look out for possible Eskimo insurgencies all over Canada and Alaska.
Which I will
An
support.
Eskimo invasion.
I think Alaska should secede from the Union.
Yeah, a giant snowball fight, a snowball rebellion. I'm sorry, it's horrible.
No, it's necessary. With that, we should wrap it up, sir. This has been great.
This
fun.
was great. Do you want to do another one on libertarianism?
Sure, and Bob Barr and all the good fun.
Well, I mean, Bob Barr. Let's get into Nozick. Let's get into the real guts of libertarianism. Where it is today.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
I'm up for it. I'm here.
All right.
Free minds, free markets, baby.
Good stuff.
Thanks, Eli.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.